Good evening. Can everyone hear me? Good evening. I hate to interrupt conversations and questions, but the idea behind tonight is that we'll keep those conversations going, first as a panel up here up front, but then later as a community in conversation around artificial intelligence. My name is Ken Chitwood. I am scholar and pastor in residence here at First Lutheran in Venice. Oh, 2 times. Some of you don't even know me yet. And I'm also an affiliate researcher at the University of Southern California Center for Research and Center for Religion and Civic Culture. First Lutheran and CRCC are the sponsors for tonight's event. I want to thank them for helping put this on. So a round of applause for CRCC and First Lutheran. This is the 3rd event in a series that we've been putting on here at First Lutheran Venice over the summer, asking the broad question, how then shall we live? We started by addressing the environment and climate change. How then shall we live in a world that seems on fire? And then second, we talked about polarization, which seems even more apropos this week and in our current conversations around politics and society, the United States. How then shall we live when nobody gets along? And then here we are tonight, our closing event, welcoming many of you here from across Los Angeles and elsewhere. Dr. Vickers, who I'll introduce in a moment, from San Diego as well, to talk about how then shall we live when AI takes over. A question we'll also challenge and kind of undermine a little bit in the course of our conversation. The way this evening is going to work is as follows. We're going to have a conversation in among the panelists here. They're going to kind of set the stage with their particular background and expertise and experience, share a little bit of the perspective that they bring to the questions around AI. And then I'm going to have some questions for them that I'll pose, and we'll kind of have a conversation up here. But then you see that mic here in the middle aisle. You're going to be welcome to come up and ask your own questions, make your own comments, and all of that to be part of this conversation. While we do encourage questions so that we can open up the conversation to many others, feel free to bring up your comments as well. We ask just that you keep your comments brief for the sake of everyone else here as well, so that many voices can be welcomed into the conversation as we continue with the evening. My fellow panelists here come from various perspectives and backgrounds and areas of expertise, and to help introduce each one of them, I'm going to start with Dr. Darby Vickers on the far stage right, or to your left. Dr. Darby Vickers is an assistant professor of philosophy at University of San Diego. Her research focuses on expertise and skill acquisition and transmission between generations and between humans and machines, and sits at the intersection of ethics, epistemology, and philosophy of education. In her research, she draws significantly on cognitive science and ancient Greek philosophy to shed light on contemporary problems in ethics of technology. She's authored articles on the ethics of artificial intelligence and doctoral education. Welcome, Dr. Vickers. Dr. Stephen Aguilar is an associate professor of education at the University of Southern California Rossier School of Education and the associate director of the USC Center for Generative AI and Society. In both roles, he studies how new technologies, both emerging and established, influence teaching, learning, and motivation. Dr. Aguilar has been featured on NPR's Air Talk and interviewed by major publications like the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, USA Today, and the Washington Post about generative AI and technology in education. Welcome, Dr. Aguilar. Dr. Ulf Hermjakob is a senior research scientist with the University of Southern California's Information Sciences Institute and its Artificial Intelligence Division and Natural Language Research Group. His current and recent research includes semantic representation of text, machine translation, especially for low-resource languages, highly multilingual tools, and USC's Greek Room project, which provides AI tools to support Bible translators, project recently featured in articles and interviews in the Washington Post, BBC Radio, and ABC Television. Welcome. Thank you. Well, I've invited each of our speakers and panelists tonight to an open round where each is going to give around 5 to 7 minutes to share their perspective on AI and address the themes they'd like to forefront as part of that conversation. And first, I'm going to invite Ulf to share a little bit from his angle on AI. Ulf, please.
Thank you very much. AI has been around for a very long time. Computers have been around since the 1940s. In the more modern sense, artificial intelligence dates back to the 1950s, so it's one of the oldest disciplines in computers. It is about intelligence exhibited by machines, and this often includes databases of facts and rules, but more and more increasingly also a lot of examples that a computer system would then learn from. There are a lot of applications, just a few: machine translation, where a computer would automatically translate a text, say, from Chinese to English, like Google Translate. A lot of people will be familiar with recommendation systems, autonomous vehicles. Computers are getting good at chess and Jeopardy, and there's a lot of improvements in healthcare with artificial intelligence. So intelligence as a term is a little bit of a moving target from an AI perspective. A lot of people really deep inside think that intelligence is what sets us humans apart from the rest of the animal kingdom and machines. So 100 years ago, people who would compute logarithms or rocket projectiles, trajectories, would be considered super intelligent, and those people would actually be called computers. These days, a simple computer can do all that very easily. It's no longer considered very intelligent. Weather forecast, which includes a lot of learning and prediction, is no longer really considered AI. So only whatever humans can do, or what AI has only recently been able to do, is in some sense considered AI. So from our perspective, it's a little bit of a moving target. Right? AI has improved dramatically over the decades. So I've been involved with AI for 40 years, starting as a young student and grad school at the University of Texas, Austin, and now 27 years at USC. And the overall trajectory and impact was just like amazing. I mean, what AI can do today is just mind-boggling. And even during the last 2 or 3 years, it's just amazing. But there's always a danger to kind of have it a little bit overhyped. And there's historical precedents. So there have been 2 AI winters where there was a lot of excitement for AI in the 50s and 60s, a lot of promises. We will be able to solve machine translation within just a few years. And then there was disillusionment. It just didn't work quite as well. And so during the 1970s, we had an AI winter with a lot of cut in funding. And then during the 1990s, again, we had another second AI winter. So the division that I worked for during that time was called the Intelligent Systems Division, because AI was not a cool, part of the name was kind of suspicious. We're back now to artificial intelligence. But it shows that there are waves of sometimes, overhyping things a little bit. There's followed by a little bit of disillusionment. But overall, the trajectory has been enormous, and I think AI is here to stay for sure. Just to give a little bit brief background on my own work. So I've been working on a lot of different AI perspectives, but mostly tied to natural language processing. So I've worked on machine translation in a number of ways, lately in particular for low resource languages. Google Translate can cover about 100 languages, but there are 7,000 more languages out there in the world that people speak, and a lot of those are disadvantaged in some sense. And so we want to be able to support not just the big languages. And one trick is when you have these low resource languages, you try to find maybe similar languages and learn from other languages and kind of leverage a little bit from similarities. I've worked on something called abstract meaning representation, where we try to teach the computer what the meaning structure of a sentence is. So if you have Rome destroyed Carthage, or Carthage was destroyed by Rome, or the destruction of Rome by the Carthaginians. They all really have the same meaning, yet they are superficially very different. So we want to capture some sort of semantics, also in order for computer, when they understand language, to have a representation that's not just syntactically maybe adequate in English, but also semantically meaningful. So we've built a large corpus there of over 70,000 sentences. I've worked on a lot of multilingual tools. One, for example, a romanizer that takes text in any of 100+ scripts and maps it to the Latin alphabet, like in English, which then facilitates, comparing strings that were originally across different scripts. Recently, I started to work on the Greek room at USC together with a colleague, and this is a project where AI tools support Bible translators. And I'm very careful here, so we don't do the Bible translation, we support translators. And this might be as mundane as doing spell checking, which we take for granted for all the major languages, but which is not available for these low resource languages out there. AI provides a lot of opportunities. I mean, the productivity is bound to go up. There's a lot of opportunities in the world of education, healthcare, and all across. There's certainly a lot of challenges. One very big one I see is disinformation. So years ago, I was sort of like not very concerned about AI and negative impacts. So having the AI taking over, knowing I was not on the radar screen, but I realize now that even imperfect partial AI can be used in bad ways. So one is disinformation, and this is something that we really have. We have elections that are influenced by disinformation bots, from St. Petersburg in Russia. We have deep fakes, and it's often enough, to sway just a certain percentage of the population who might be a little bit more gullible to do that. There's certainly crime. That's a challenge. You have issues of privacy with all this data around. There's certainly the danger of losing some jobs. There's a danger even of concentration. So even in AI fields, we see that the big companies, whether it's Google and Facebook and Microsoft and so forth, they have immense powers. They can use hundreds of millions of computers and processors to do things that you just can't do with what a university, even like USC, is able to do. And so there is really the danger of some concentration. And there's certainly quite a bit of impact and discussion to be had on that. Education, it's a challenge over there. Students might wonder, why should I learn Spanish? Why should I learn history if I can just ask AI? I found that as an instructor at USC this past spring semester, students rely more and more on ChatGPT to do even their programming tasks. I've had some cases where students would, on all their open assignments where they could use ChatGPT and other resources, they would get an A+. And then during the midterm, which is just paper and pen without access to any electronics, they would have an F-. And so there's clearly challenges, and this did not happen 2 years ago, and it's a little bit a year ago, and now there's more and more of that. AI is here to stay. We need to include it into education, but we need to find ways to show students that they have to do critical thinking, and they have to learn some of the stuff on their own, and not just always rely on AI. There's a lot of famous examples where AI can hallucinate things. So if you ask ChatGPT, what's Berlin famous for? It will give a beautiful answer, well-written, well-structured, and correct. If you ask it, what is Bünde, my tiny little German hometown, famous for? It will again produce a very well-written, well-structured, and very compelling answer, except it's all hallucinated. 95% wrong, got the location right, and nothing else, right? And so we have to learn to be critical of what we get from AI. A lot of it is useful, but we cannot rely on it at face value. So this is important, for students, for all of us leaders to learn. How much time do I have?
You can probably finish it up.
Okay. And so there's really challenges for AI scientists. How do we make this reliability visible? We need to be honest about, are we just guessing, or do we have pretty solid evidence? We also need to kind of provide information regarding potential bias, discrimination, right? So AI systems learn from data, and they might learn that maybe if you have a physician and a nurse, the physician tends to be more male and the nurse female, and it has these stereotypes that are embedded in a lot of training data, and the AI might just kind of really learn that without malice, but it might lead to continued discrimination and bias. And I'm going to leave the rest for our open discussion.
Thank you very much, Ulf. As you can tell, Ulf is a wealth of information and knowledge, experience. Appreciate the perspectives he brings in terms of the longevity of AI, its presence in our lives already, and questioning things like intelligence and critical thinking around that. Thank you very much, Ulf. Stephen, please, from your perspective in education.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I am an educational psychologist by training. So often I think about how do we learn, but more importantly, why do we learn? What motivates us to actually engage in something, and how do we persist for that engagement? So my entry point into this is really thinking about how this new technology trigger of generative AI specifically, which is what we generally talk about these days when we think about AI, how does that affect how we do things, right? So if the overarching question is how are we to live, my slice of that is how are we to use AI to learn? And I want to sort of plant a few seeds and not get into the weeds too much, because the seeds that I plant are, when you hear me talk, these serve as touchstones that I often go back to. So often, whenever there's a new technology, I often, like, if I had a projector behind me, I would put up the slide for the Gartner hype cycle. And this idea is that whenever there's this new tech trigger, something new, something exciting, something that is evocative of things that we couldn't do before, there's often this peak of inflated expectations where we think it can do everything. And that's kind of normal, right? It's something new that we had not experienced before. Then we realize that it can't actually do everything. In fact, what it can do is fairly limiting. And then we go to the trough of disillusionment, right? Where we go down, we're like, I can't do anything. Eventually, we realize that, well, no, the truth is obviously somewhere in the middle, right? We get to this slope of enlightenment, right? Where we start to realize, okay, here's what we can actually do with it. And then we find ways to be productive with it. And so when I say how are we to use AI, that's what I mean. How do we actually get to the point where we're thinking about using AI in our everyday lives, knowing that we're actually already doing it, right? If you have a smartphone, there's a lot of what we would say is narrow AI embedded within that smartphone. It can do a lot of really complex things very well, but it might not be able to generate like a paragraph, whether or not it's real or fake. It might not be able to mimic human language, but it can read your face. And you can train it to read other faces, or it could sort of finish some sentences poorly. That's still a version of AI that it's not evocative of this sense of thinking it can do everything, because we live with it already. And there are reasons for this. The biggest reason that I like to think about when I'm giving talks about AI is to take a step back and to really think about analog technologies, things that we take for granted. So if you think of just like a common door, for example, it suggests a use to you depending on what that doorknob looks like, right? And this is its perceived affordance. If it has a pull handle, you want to pull it. If it has a push plate, you want to push it, right? This is Don Norman's idea of perceived affordances in design. And AI is right now at the point, or generative AI specifically, where we're not quite sure what those perceived affordances are. Like, we know we interact with it through a chatbot, through this idea of if I pose a question, it will generate an answer that I think might be okay, right? So that's sort of our entry point into it. But we haven't quite figured out what that everyday use is yet. And I think that's what we're struggling with in education, is students are struggling with when it's okay to use AI. Instructors are struggling with when it's okay to incorporate AI into their own practice, right? So there's this tension of, well, if you're giving me an essay that is just expository that says, give me the main reasons for the fall of the Roman Empire, of course I could write that. That essay has already been written countless times. Is that essay actually something that you want a student to reproduce, or do you actually want them to think critically about those reasons and to actually use writing as a way to think critically, whereas the writing itself isn't actually the product that you're evaluating? So that's the real tension that we're experiencing right now within education, and it has a number of different forms, both in terms of students thinking that they can get away with a lot because there are lagging policies within educational institutions in terms of how to incorporate AI, starting from the draconian, it's banned, which sure, but they're gonna use it anyway. So you can't really ban something that they have access to. Even if you block access to it in K-12 schools, students can still get their cell phones out and use a different network to access generative AI tools. So, but there's also this other side, which is use whatever. I don't actually have a policy. I'm just not going to think about it. And that's not necessarily a good place to be either, because then there's no structure around thinking through this new tool and what students might be able to do with it and what they might not be able to do with it, what they should do with it, what they shouldn't do with it. Similar technologies, if you sort of think about, human computers, when calculators became ubiquitous, similar conversations were had in terms of really thinking about, well, will students be able to understand numeracy? Will they be able to understand how to add, how to subtract? This machine that I can punch keys with my hand is going to eliminate this critical aspect of what it means to learn math. That's obviously not true. However, we don't necessarily just put a bunch of calculators in front of kindergartners and first graders and say, go nuts, right? We've identified milestones where it's okay for students to use tools. And after a while, we don't expect college students to necessarily do a lot of hand computations anymore. We've sort of moved on from that. And we're at this inflection point where we're trying to sort out when can generative AI be used to actually support student learning as opposed to replace what students do to demonstrate learning. And over at USC, we've done a number of studies where students, they think about this too, right? We just finished a study where about close to 50 students were given a prompt and say, you can use generative AI to write, like a letter as though you were going to apply for a job, right? This is Writing 150. It's sort of the basic writing course. And what students who were given access to generative AI said, well, it gave us good templates. However, it deprived me of my voice. It deprived me of the complexity of what it means to be a writer for me. It's robotic language, right? All the things that we would expect, given the fact that large language models sort of push us towards the center, right? They're not meant to be stylized. They're actually meant to be fairly generic, unless you try to kind of prompt it and poke it to do other things. But really, ChatGPT is vanilla when there are lots of other flavors out there. So when we're thinking about students and how they're interpreting it, I often push back on the notion that students are naive thinkers themselves because they do know what the limitations are. However, without policies and without pushing them to use it and find ways that their use can actually help their learning, they're going to do what they tend to do, which is find the path of least resistance to get them finished with that course.
Thank you so very much, Stephen, for sharing from your perspective as well about some of the more productive uses of AI, the affordances of AI, some policy questions, and the way students are just going to use it anyways. I think all of us in teaching have learned that already. Darby.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be here. And so my way of thinking about AI is what can we use AI for in order to promote well-being, and what kind of restrictions do we want to have on the uses of AI to make sure that people can continue to live well and, in fact, thrive in a technologically infused society. And so there are a lot of good uses of AI that I'm sure we'll be talking about as we answer some of your questions. But oftentimes when people invite me to come out and talk about my perspective on AI and what's most important to me about the AI space, the expectation is often that I'm going to say something about disinformation, and particularly with an election coming up, I'm going to say something about the elections. And of course, this is really important, right? Because I'm thinking both about well-being on an individual scale and on a societal scale. But I'm not a political scientist or a political philosopher. There are some really interesting things we should be thinking about in terms of things like deep fakes, in terms of the kinds of AI-generated content that can be put on social media that will push people in one direction or the other. And in fact, with the deep fake stuff, there's actually probably my favorite Star Trek episode of all time is an episode of Deep Space Nine called In the Pale Moonlight, which is about exactly what can happen when you use deep fakes to try to manipulate a political situation. So if any of you haven't seen that, it's a really fun episode. But what I really care about is how is it that we're going to prepare the next generation to live well with artificial intelligence and to figure out exactly how they would like to see it used in society and what kind of restrictions they want to put on it. So part of this comes back to my research in philosophy of education and thinking about the way that AI is infused in education. And particularly, I want to hit on a couple of things that both of my colleagues here have already talked about. But specifically, one of the things that I am really concerned about with artificial intelligence is that students use it to shortcut some of the struggles that they might have in education, right? Oftentimes, even at the Learning Center at USD, and I'm sure at learning centers all over the place, they'll say, well, if you're really stuck on this essay, you should use ChatGPT or Claude or one of these large language models to brainstorm for you. But there's something in education known as desirable difficulty, right? You want, in order to learn well, you need to actually have a little bit of challenge and face that kind of struggle yourself, because this not only promotes better learning, but it also promotes better long-term retention over time. So if you as a student aren't spending time struggling, trying to get that sentence right, or not spending time struggling, trying to figure out a topic for that essay, that actually shortchanges your learning to a pretty significant extent, both in terms of critical thinking skills, but also in terms of the long-term retention. And there's some really interesting studies that show that desirable difficulty is radically important. This is particularly important because in the LAUSD school system, as well as in school systems in New York and New Jersey, they're introducing AI tutoring systems. Oftentimes, I think at least the New York and New Jersey are picking up on Conmingo, which is created by Sol Khan. And a lot of these tutoring systems are supposed to give hints, but often those hints actually are preventing students from doing the kind of struggle that they need to be able to get this information. And there's a thought by a lot of the engineers that I talk to that AI tutoring systems are the way of the future because we can individualize education, but we're actually preventing students from doing some of the things that are really important and from working together if they're working with an individual tutoring system, because working with their peers and their classmates is one of the best ways that students can learn. In addition to this, there's of course biases and hallucinations that get brought into this. We already know that students with particular types of accents end up getting worse results out of large language models, in part because there are, and I don't mean accents as in like the speech accents, although we do know this from spoken models, but also just like the way that you phrase things and the way that your grammar works, you'll actually get different results, even if your sentence has the same meaning as somebody who's using more standard English. And this is something that really worries me about the kinds of biases that are going to show up and the way that students are going to be treated by these AI systems that they're interacting with based on the way that they articulate themselves. In addition to this, I'm really concerned with the ethics of the students that we are training to be the next generation of innovators, right? In Silicon Valley, a lot of the people who are doing innovations are young students that are coming sort of directly out of school, have a really good background in computer science, but many of them don't have significant ethics training. And so one of the things that I work on is what would it look like to try to train people to make better ethical decisions? And oftentimes what people think is we just need a better set of rules that we can put in place to get people to comply with those rules, and that's sufficient for ethical action. But in fact, there are a lot of reasons to believe that this is not the case. In particular, we can see even in bioethics with things like gene editing. There was a set of rules that were created for recombinant DNA and gene editing back in the 1970s. But when CRISPR came out, which was another way of editing genes, those rules didn't apply anymore because they were too specific to the technology that had already come out. And so it was really important for people like Jennifer Doudna to come up with a new set of rules. And so rules aren't flexible, and given how quickly technology is changing, it's really important to have ethics as a skill set rather than as a set of standards that we have to comply with. And then the final thing I'd like to say is that one of the other things we really need is AI literacy. I hosted a lot of conversations back in 2021 through the National Humanities Center. I did some moderation for them, and I did a couple of other more casual conversations. And I found that what was happening, and this was during pandemic over Zoom, what I found that what was happening was the engineers were messaging me in back channel chat and saying, a lot of the things that the humanists and the artists are talking about and saying are AI are not actually AI, and a lot of the criticisms they're making aren't about AI specifically or aren't worded correctly or don't make sense. And the humanists were messaging me in the back channel chat and saying, why is it that I can't get these engineers to understand my concerns? And so what I think really needs to happen is we need to have a shared vocabulary and a shared understanding of both the technology and the ethics and the sort of humanistic concerns that we all might bring together. And so we really need to think about what it looks like, not just in college education where I'm teaching ethics, but also in K through 12 education, trying to bring in AI literacy and AI ethics and just technology literacy and ethics in general as well, right? Bioethics is moving on too. And having that be part of the conversation much earlier for the next generation so that they can make good decisions about how they're designing technology for the future.
Thank you so very much. Helping us think through some of the ethical questions, some of the connections with previous technologies as well, and to kind of build on what you ended with, which is AI literacy. I want to ask a question because we've added around a few terms. We've talked about narrow AI, generative AI, machine learning, deep learning. We're using a lot of different pieces of language here up front. But would one of you be willing to kind of talk about the definitions of AI up front and kind of what the AI we're talking about is? I mean, you got into this a little bit, Ulf, and talked about that. But Stephen, narrow AI, would you mind defining that for folks real quick and what that is compared to?
Yeah, I guess the distinction that will resonate the best for people is think of narrow AI as having a very narrow purpose that does something, right? So my example is if I open my phone with my face as opposed to like a code, that model, the back-end machine learning model has been trained to read my face, right? That's a type of AI that does one narrow task very well and very efficiently, but if I can't do anything else with it, I can't talk to it, it won't understand me if I yell at it, if I'm wearing a mask. Like it does that thing, it's narrow. And it's something that has already been embedded in our human experience and has been for a number of years. Well, the reason we're talking about AI now is because of the advent of generative AI, this idea that there is large language model-based technologies that mimic human language. And that was something that is very surprising to us. Now, whether or not it does it well isn't really, like I can bracket that for these comments, but it's something that's novel to us because it reads as though you can have a conversation with it. It answers in complete sentences. I can pose nearly any question, and as long as they didn't put certain guardrails, they will attempt to answer it. And that it's not that it's pulling data that exists in the world. It is constructing those sentences in a way that is novel. And that's something that even in the user experience, you see like the little dot kind of move around as though it's writing to you. That's a design affordance that's meant to sort of reinforce that notion that it's being generated as opposed to here's a block of text that I found on Wikipedia, which is what Google would do potentially. So I think that's the first key distinction that's important to think about.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And we had a pre-event dinner with some folks from USC's compelling preaching cohort. And during that dinner, Ulf, you made not a distinction, but a connection actually between machine learning and deep learning and seeing them less as very different from each other, but growing together or out from one another. Would you maybe talk a little bit about that between narrow generative machine, deep learning, those types of things?
So machine learning is the more general term. Machine learning has been around for many decades, and it involves a wide range of machine learning techniques. And one of them is neural network architectures, and more recently, neural networks with a lot of different layers called deep learning. So the deep learning really means there are neural networks that have layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. The idea of neural networks is not new, but it's really become very prominent. We have computational resources that are much bigger, so we have computers with a lot of GPUs, right? Very powerful computers. You can train models on hundreds of millions of computers. We have huge amounts of data. That is really new. We have better hardware, a lot of data, so that makes the deep learning possible. But one of the disadvantages, so it needs a lot of data, so it applies well where there's a lot of data, but it's not really very transparent, and it doesn't really explain how it comes to answer something, right? So that's the major drawback. One is, doesn't really work for very low resource languages, right? So if I have a language and I have only data for like 1,000 sentences, it's not gonna work. And it doesn't really explain well. So we don't really know how much we can rely and answer on directly using deep learning. And so that needs to be complemented by other AI techniques to give the user really a feedback of, I'm pretty sure this is correct versus, I'm basically guesstimating the answer.
Yeah. It's this continually developing technology that developed out of previous technologies in this realm, if I could sum up more technical issues. Now, as we've talked about here, and you've kind of connected these continuities, human societies have encountered technological revolutions before and in the past, and we've dealt with them in varying ways, and they've ended certain things and they've started new things. But how might the increased use of artificial intelligence be different from or similar to the increasing use of automation or other technologies that we've witnessed in the past? And Darby, perhaps I'll start with you to talk a little bit about the differences and similarities with other technological revolutions we've seen.
Sure. Yeah. So there's a lot of similarities with technological revolutions over time. Think even about the revolution of the microchip, right? So now we have microchips in absolutely everything. You have it in your toaster. You have it in your car. You have it in AI. It's something that has sort of technologically infused everything so that we can sort of create all of these different computerized systems that fade into the background of what we're using. So from my perspective, a lot of what we need to think about in terms of dealing with this particular technological revolution is looking at the past and trying to figure out what has happened in the way that society has changed and how we can think about doing that better with the particular technological revolution that we're in at the moment. And this is not just looking at the past of like other types of technological revolutions. So for example, there was an increase in automation during the 1800s, and there was the Luddite Revolution. For any of you who are interested, Brian Marchant, who was a writer at the LA Times, wrote a really incredible book recently called Blood in the Machine, which is about the sort of problem with automation in the creation of stockings and how that radically changed the economy of Northern England during the early 1800s, and how all of the people that were put out of work by this automation ended up going in and breaking the machines and sort of trying to start a labor movement around this. That would allow them to have some kind of a social safety net to not stop the technology so much, but allow them to not just be immediately put out of work with no sort of hope of retraining. And Brian Marchant in this book does a really nice job of thinking about how we can use that to think about the technological revolution today and the way that AI is going to infuse the labor market and what kind of jobs are going to get taken away and how we should think about trying to organize around this so that this doesn't cause massive social problems of people being put out of work. In addition, I love looking back at things like there was a technologist who is really early in the 1950s version of AI named Norbert Wiener, who worked at MIT. And he was really interested not only in trying to create better technology, but also in thinking about the ethical implications. And he actually wrote the first AI ethics book in 1950, and it's called The Human Use of Human Beings. It was republished in 1954, and there is an edition that is in print right now that you can get a hold of. And it's really interesting because he predicts predicts a bunch of things like the gig economy and the ways in which there's going to be a sort of a set of people that own the technology doing a lot of the sort of mid-level labor, and then a lot of really terrible jobs of like categorizing photos and things like that. That will then feed that information into the technology so it can do its job better. And he sort of called this out as a warning, and we're now experiencing many of the things that he's talking about. So I want us to think about, as we're sort of dealing with this new technological revolution, what lessons can we learn from the past? Because there are these analogies between what's happening with this technological revolution and the technological revolutions that have happened previously.
Stephen or Ulf, do you want to build on any of this or further talk about how lessons from the past and other technological revolutions we've seen, how we might be able to react to and adapt to AI accordingly?
So there are a lot of analogies. Thank you, Darby. One difference is, one thing that's a little bit different is being able to pinpoint problems, right? So if you have a Bible translation, very famously from several hundred years ago, that will in the Ten Commandments say, "Thou shalt commit adultery." They forgot the not, and they were taken to task for it, right? As you can imagine, you have a steam engine that blows up, well, you can pinpoint that to a company that produced that. But today, with a lot of information, it's very, very difficult, right? So I might have some analogies. So we have free speech, but there's some limitations. You can't yell fire in a theater. But if somebody does that, and people died being trampled to death, you can take somebody to task. This is much more difficult with AI, where you don't really know where things come from. So just a small anecdote here. Even in machine translation, we had one case for a small language where the output of translation was very suspicious and weird. We said, where does that come from? Is it our algorithm? No. Is it the data? Well, some of the data looks weird. What's that data based on? Oh, it's somewhere from the internet. And then I did a close analysis and basically figured out that source on the internet was actually AI generated. So some AI hallucinated some bad translations, and that was used then by another artificial intelligence module at face value to train their system, and and you basically have the problem. So we need to really keep track of where the information really is from. This is often very difficult. Which really means that some of the information gateways, social media, really need to be held accountable, because we will not be able to trace it down to office XYZ somewhere in St. Petersburg or who knows where. So there's new challenges there. And one thing is we really need people to be professional arbiters there. So at the end of the day, we need professional teachers that can set things right. We need professional journalists who can really drill down, what is fact, what is fiction, what is...
Thank you. Appreciate that.
We need, good scientists to do all that. And so that just doesn't go away.
Yeah. And Stephen, if I could kind of ask a more pointed question to build on this, because you've talked about wanting to look at kind of productive ways of using AI in education. So what new possibilities might it open up for us in society? Ulf has kind of pointed this, that we need people to do these types of jobs, or Darby says that, jobs around AI as well. What would you see some of the new possibilities in education or new possibilities in society at large for how to use AI or how to build new jobs around it as well, perhaps?
Let's think about that second question. But for the first one, I think that one of the things that instructors and teachers are very good at, and that we often don't give them enough credit for, is reading a room and sort of understanding what a given student might need at any given point in time. The challenge is that, so I was a classroom middle school teacher for a number of years before I do what I do now. Students just got older. But you still attend to what's happening with the room and try to understand and diagnose what students need to learn at a given time. One of the biggest challenges of being a classroom teacher is that just because you know a student needs a thing doesn't mean you can give them that thing, right? So I might know, for example, that if I taught 7th grade, I did teach 7th grade, that my reading levels in that class are anywhere from, can't decode a sentence to can read high school texts. That was literally the range in my classroom. As a teacher, and often our response to that is teaching to grade level, which is often teaching to the middle or a little below that, and then doing what you can, right? And what you can isn't always enough, right? So there would be students who didn't have the advanced textbook to actually, engage it and grow. And there would be students who would be continually be left behind. So one of the things I'm excited about is this idea that we can begin to use some well-designed generative AI tools to begin to actually give students what they need at that given point in time, right? You give students that grade level appropriate text that's still on subject, right? So we can all discuss the thing, but you're reading something that's at your level, and another student is reading something that's at their level, but we can all engage in a discourse. And to Darby's earlier point, like that you want to hit, ideally, every student's sort of zone of proximal development, right? This idea where every student is challenged in exactly the way they need to be challenged in a given moment. And I think I'm sort of excited for the possibility of that happening. The sort of ethical implications and the larger question is who owns and shapes those technologies? Because that will define how those technologies are experienced by students and how they're used by teachers, and which jobs get eliminated and which ones don't, right? Because we've had the CEO of OpenAI admittedly say, I want to eliminate the median worker, right? What does that mean? That means the average worker. I want to sort of I don't need them. Because those tasks can be done by other people. That's why I'm generally very suspicious of anyone who puts forth the argument of saying, there can be a teacher that's a conductor of like 50 or 100 students, but they're really just interacting with computers and learning at their level. That's not what it means to be human. That's not what it means to actually learn something. We learn together. We learn through, our technology mediates that sometimes, but we don't, the coupling isn't us and the computer, it's us and people. So that's what I want to make sure that we constantly think about as we're thinking about what the next jobs are and that sort of thing.
Can I make one small point real fast?
Please.
So there's a really wonderful text called The Fun They Had, which was written, it's a short story that was written by Isaac Asimov in 1951, and it's exactly the problem that Stephen has just identified. It's a world in which every student has an individualized robotic tutor that they work with, and they all end up hating school because they don't get to interact with other people, they don't get to have those discussions together, and it's sort of getting them to a certain extent challenged in the way that they need to be challenged, but they're not enjoying the material because they don't get to share it with others and they don't get to have that human experience as part of education. And Asimov figured this out in 1951, right at the beginning of a lot of the sort of AI and cybernetics revolution. So it's worth thinking back to some of these historical things to remind us that we should be thinking really critically about this before we start just sort of charging ahead with putting these tools in the classroom, and think more carefully about how to do that.
I want to dig a little deeper on this because we've got multiple educators on the panel, and then we have people who are parents and educators in the classroom or grandparents. We also have preachers who are engaged in theological education for adult learners and younger. So with that, why, what, and how of technology and education for people who are going to be increasingly surrounded with, and their lives are going to be suffused with, artificial intelligence technology? How do you guide people through that so that they're also ready for it, right? And they can adapt their lives to whatever is coming and how AI is going to be expanding, as we all feel it's kind of inevitable at this point. Any thoughts there in terms of how to work with people as they encounter it in their everyday lives?
Okay. So first of all, teaching critical thinking is important. We've touched on this before. People really need to understand that there's limit to AI. And then I think one future direction that I see is that a lot of jobs will be hybrid. You will have the human and the computer really work as a team. As a human translator, you can still do a much better job than machine translation. But if a human translator uses the MT as a tool, he or she can be twice as productive, right? And there's so much need for translation out there. It's a big field. They're never going to run out of work. So I don't really see this as, is it going to be the AI versus the human? It's really the team together that will make progress. I see this for teaching, right? So you need a human teacher, but they would benefit from having an AI assistant. We even developed a tool at USC called the Chinese Room, where one of the challenges was to kind of build training example for these very low resource languages as Oromo or Uyghur or something like that. One idea was, can we translate text from Oromo, Bengali, and languages that you might have never heard of ourselves to English? And what could possibly go wrong? Well, of course, we don't know the language. Turns out that we developed a tool that basically teams up computer and human, and they both have their strengths, and the computer will provide some support, the human will provide a lot of common sense and human intelligence, and together as a team, they could achieve a translation that neither of them could really achieve on their own. So that was like a very nice finding. And I think we'll see that a lot, so we need to be able to be critical towards AI, and then have a certain willingness to use it as an assistant.
So my goal for anyone who's thinking about a new technology is to take a step and really think about it as though you were a designer. And one of my, I'm going to dust off my philosophy hat here, because one of my favorite ways of thinking about this is through the lens of Heideggerian philosophy, right? This idea that for any given tool, a tool can be sort of ready to hand, which is something that, think of a pen that you use. You don't think about picking up a writing instrument and looking at it and thinking, this is where you just write, right? You just express yourself through the tool. And there are countless tools in our lives that do this. From something from the mundane to like driving here to something more complex, like you potentially using a computer, or if you're a craftsman, using your tools like at your workshop. But when it breaks, that's when you might notice it, right? If my pen runs out of ink, or if the pencil lead snaps, right, it becomes broken, and that's when I begin to potentially examine it, potentially fix it. When it comes to digital technologies, I think that analogy still works. It's just a little harder to think about what those design affordances are, and what it means for something to be present versus ready to hand. But for concrete advice I can give folks is, for any given task that you're showing someone, or that you're helping them do with AI, is to really think through, what does it mean to actually work through and with this technology? What's being gained and what's actually being lost? And to not think about it in generalities, but to actually be very specific, right? And one of the examples I often turn to is, I've spoken with legal counsel in a number of big firms, and one of the things that they say is that a lot of AI models can kind of almost do what a junior associate does in terms of writing a brief for me. That doesn't mean we want them to, right? Because that expertise might get gutted over time. So human AI pairings, simply because they're possible, that might not mean that we want to necessarily move in that direction. And we have to decide when it's okay to move in that direction. So for any emerging technology that increases efficiency, it's important to pause and to really think about, why is efficiency the thing that I want right now? Because often, especially with learning, you want to be inefficient. You want to struggle. You want to actually understand the concept deeply. And you want to push the folks that you're actually training and thinking with to do that. And because that's how you become sort of a master at something. That's how you become an expert, is sort of pushing past that wall and not sort of leaning on AI. But once you're past it, then, I can use AI, selfishly, I can use AI all the time, because I sort of know where my limits are. I know when it's giving me something I need, I know when to edit it, and I know when not to use it. When I can sort of feel when I'm being lazy and be like, well, I probably should write this literature review on my own. But that's not everyone, right? So you need to sort of know where that line is, and know how to teach people where that line is.
And in addition to that, I think that there's something along, so definitely knowing where the line is. I even remember when I took AP Calculus, on the AP exam, there was a section where we were allowed to use a calculator, and there was a section where we weren't allowed to use a calculator. And it was that we had to prove that we had both the skills of being able to do certain types of things with the aid of the tool that was at hand, but we also had to prove that we could do certain graphing stuff without having the graphing calculator do it for us. And that was something that was really important and was part of the assessment that was built into the AP exam. I don't know if this is still true. But in addition to this, there's also a really important thing in education, which is teaching students where the tools break down so that they can make those decisions for themselves. And there's a really sort of interesting researcher, and I have totally forgotten what her name is, and I feel terrible about this, but she did these really incredible experiments during lockdown where she had children with their families get a sort of pre-made AI device or some kind of an AI program that they could access through the internet, and they would try to figure out what it was used for. So they would have like an Alexa device and they would be able to talk to it and figure out when is like somebody's accent thick enough that Alexa has difficulty interpreting what they're saying, or at what point does it provide you with mistaken information, or does it misunderstand the commands you're giving it. Similarly, they had sort of things where the students were supposed to take pictures of things and get AI to recognize it, and like, what angle do you have to put a camera at to trick an AI into thinking that it's something other than what the picture is actually taken of? And learning the limits of that makes it feel like these tools are no longer magic, but rather things that have a specific purpose and specific use cases. And then we can figure out how to supplement them and how to work with them and how to use them critically in the way that we live our lives, and which of them we want to engage with on a day-to-day basis, or which of them we only want to engage with in certain circumstances. So actually letting kids play around with these things and trying to break them and figure out, and then also how to fix them. Is there a way that you can then retrain your sort of camera system so that it actually learns that a face this way is the same as the sort of face in profile? These things are really important, and they should be integrated into students who are learning how to deal with this technology so that they can then make good choices about how they want to use it in the future.
Thank you very much. We're about to enter into our open round, and so what we're going to have is our mic here in the center. If you want to start, formulating your questions, maybe some of you have already got them written down, you can start queuing there as I ask the last question to our panel before we go here. We've talked about menial labor, junior associates, under-resourced languages, and I can't help but always think about how vulnerable communities, marginalized communities, underprivileged communities are probably those most likely to be hit hardest by changes brought on by AI technology. And so how might we bring our technical know-how or our educational values or virtue ethics or whatever it might be to this conversation to be able to not only think about ourselves in this moment, but how others might be impacted beyond our particular status in society or state in society? Any concluding thoughts in that direction?
I can get us started. I mean, one of the things that I sort of push on whenever I have a discussion about AI or emerging technologies is that we simply replicate the structures that are already present. They just look a little different. Like, we might use different tools, but disparities are going to continue to exist. It's just how those disparities get expressed, right? 4 years ago, when we all had to suffer through Zoom, like, some of us laughed because we could suffer through Zoom. There were a number of students who couldn't suffer through Zoom, right? Because they didn't have access to broadband internet to have live instruction. That hasn't changed, right? There wasn't a big push to increase our capacity and our infrastructure. We didn't tell Spectrum or other telecom companies to build more broadband in markets that weren't profitable. We told them to make it cheaper for a little while, and then we supplemented that, what they did. Right, so the decisions that we made back then are indicative to potential decisions we're making moving forward, which is often we choose to not solve the underlying problems. We instead choose to find band-aids that help us look away long enough or stem the bleeding. So it is a hard question, and I think it's a question that every person needs to answer for themselves in terms of what, in my role, can I do to ensure that any disruption that happens through the result of AIs isn't felt more heavily by a community that wouldn't have felt it otherwise. But again, it's not, you don't just have that conversation about AI. That's a conversation you could have literally had 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. Whether or not a given person decides to think in those ways now, I don't know, right? So it's a somewhat, I often, like in my own sort of work, find the same problems with different outfits, and that's, to me, sort of indicative of a lack of political will to actually make substantive changes in the way that things are given to folks.
Problems not perhaps with AI, but with us. Yeah. If I may summarize. Darby, Ulf, any concluding words on that?
Yeah. So I think there are actually a lot of opportunities for AI to help people. So this might be making information available, not in just English and a few other big languages, but in hundreds or even thousands of languages. We might have healthcare information that might be made available to hospitals that are ill-equipped and undertrained in the third world that might really benefit them and really have the latest insights of the Mayo Clinic and others be available. But there's also responsibility because if it's purely market-driven, some of them will not happen, right? So if people only look at the dollar bottom line, then AI benefits of healthcare, of having information available in other languages might fall short. And so as a society and as governments, I think we need to then make sure that the potential benefits of AI really reach all parts of the world and society.
Darby?
So there are lots of things that AI can do that are incredibly helpful to marginalized communities. So for example, with disabilities, there are all sorts of AI tools that can be used for people with low vision to read signs. And there are tools that can be used for a variety of people with different sorts of disabilities to be able to access stuff that they couldn't otherwise. There is a book that was written by a law school professor at USD named Orly Lobel called The Equality Machine, which is about a lot of the really cool innovations that are possible with AI to try to help people in various types of marginalized communities. However, one of the problems that I had with Professor Lobel's book was that she just didn't really create any kind of structures for thinking about what incentives do we need to put in place to get AI companies to actually focus on the tools that are going to help people rather than focusing on the things that are going to take jobs away from, say, intro-level programmers, right? I teach a lot of computer students who are terrified that the entry-level jobs that they would be setting themselves up for aren't going to be there by the time that they graduate from school. And so the question is, how do we create these incentives? And I'm not an economist, I don't know, but I know that there's a big problem with venture capital being poured into AI companies because those companies don't need to be profitable. Like OpenAI right now is not a profitable company. It's thriving because venture capitalists are convinced that it will eventually be profitable, and so they're willing to throw money at it for the next, say, 5 to 10 years, up until the point where it actually becomes profitable. This is something that happened with Uber as well. And so my concern as a teacher and as an ethicist is, I would like to train my students who are going off, who are, business students that are, going to go off and be that next generation of like financiers and VCs and, be the advisors to those VCs who have MBAs. And I want to have the students that are computer scientists that want to design the next generation of this AI technology to be thinking really carefully about the ethical implications of what they're doing and trying to figure out how to change that system so we can incentivize AI for good rather than all of the types of problematic AI that are either taking jobs or doing these other things or using data sets that we know end up with biased results and can cause these really horrible effects on society. So as far as I can tell, the best thing we can do is try to just get the next generation to want to change the system and want to make sure that we're leading in a good direction. And I'm hoping that we can manage to do that.
Thank you very much. Questions from the community here? I saw somebody there and then they sat back down. Maybe they got tired as we continued talking. Yeah, please.
So, yeah, they use it. And some of my colleagues go the full spectrum to describe of this outlawed person.
One moment. Can everyone hear? I just want to make sure everyone can hear.
Very good.
Yeah.
It's,
Now, can you hear me?
Perfect.
yeah.
Excellent. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So I'm a high school teacher. Yeah, I see how my colleagues have responded with, you can't use it at all, to, I'm just going to pretend I don't see it. I think for me, my biggest concern is that because this is a different kind of technology, because it's artificial intelligence, that I've already seen how this takes an emotional and mental toll on my students, because even if they're using it, whether we know it is not as educators, they know, and they recognize I'm struggling to struggle. Or their greatest, I gave my students a survey at the beginning of the year of like, what are the hard things for you as a student? And the number one thing is not being able to come up with my own ideas. And so the conversations I had with students who used it was recognizing I'm not intelligent. I need this to tell me. So even when I tried using the ideas of like, hey, dude, use it like Wikipedia sources, try to like get ideas started, even that is crippling to them. And I guess my concern then is in the long run, what is the long-term effect this is going to have on this generation, not just because they're not cognitively equipped for maybe the tasks that are there in these future careers, but how it shaped their view of self. And the response that a lot of adults that they feel is that they actually are dumb for even getting sucked into this. And so how can we as adults be positive in teaching them their view of self as they're trying to use the tool without debilitating their intelligence? It's a lot, so.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Panelists, how might we be able to work with students who are debilitated or who are feeling threatened by this or struggling to struggle?
So I think that one of the, at least off the cuff, one of the things that I would consider doing, right, is to help students understand that even their motivation to engage in a task can be understood in a fairly, like, I say technical way, but it doesn't have to be presented that way, right? So if we take sort of an off-the-shelf theory of academic motivation or just motivation in general, like self-determination theory, it posits sort of, we are motivated to act because of three things, right? That we feel confident that we can, that we have a sense of autonomy, so it is our action that is being sort of, we get to do something, we're not being forced, and that we have a sense of relatedness or belonging in terms of, in the context where we're doing it. So one of the things that's possible in that particular situation is to simply just diagnose that with the students and have them think through what they're feeling academically through those lenses, right? Is it that, and I heard at least two things that came up while you were talking, which is this idea that they don't feel competent because they're sort of offloading their struggle and even in ideation to a machine, right? And if you keep doing that, you will feel hollow, right? Especially if you're sort of asked to stand on your own, right? If I'm, I don't have a good analogy, so I won't try. But similarly, if there's, if I feel like I don't even get to shape what's happening through like my sense of autonomy, then my motivation might also be undercut. So one of the things that that we might do in that situation, and this is sort of riffing off of something that Darby mentioned, was just have them break it. Like just if you keep pushing, ChatGPT isn't great. It's fine, but you can break it if you try. I've had it struggle with creating paragraphs out of bullets, and I'm like, okay, I said paragraphs, and you just keep giving me bullets, right? So having that task where students find the boundaries of what a technology can do can reinforce the fact that they actually do know more or know enough to break it. Sometimes knowing that you can break a thing just gives you power over that thing, and that's sufficient to not feel like you need to like lean on it all the time. So that's sort of the first thing outside of, or I should say the second thing that they could do outside of just having that conversation where it's like, well, those feelings are valid and here's why. And there's this research that shows that if you don't feel competent, if you don't have a sense of autonomy, and that if you don't have a sense of belonging or relatedness, you're not going to feel like you can do something. So those feelings are valid, and sometimes having students think in those terms might sort of get them to break through, I think.
In addition to that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Darby, and then Ulf.
Oh, I totally agree. And that was one of the things I was thinking about as well. But in addition to that, I've heard some stories about people doing sort of constitutional conventions about using LLMs in their classrooms, where they get the students together to think about not just like when is it acceptable to use it, but when is it a good idea to use it, and having them have the autonomy to be able to work that out together and not having that sort of imposed by the teacher, but with you serving as like a facilitator to try to get them to think through all of of the issues that they're running into might give them another sort of sense of control and motivation around thinking about using it more carefully. And inevitably, some people are going to end up violating whatever sort of codes and ideas they've come up with. But then they'll be like, yeah, but if I had done it the way I was supposed to, then I wouldn't feel bad about this right now. And that sort of gives them motivation in the future to like do things the right way. So that might be another sort of possibility for thinking through this in the classroom.
Well, so quick follow-up. So I agree that, you know, there are times when you use AI, and then there are good times not to use it, where you really create other skills. And so as a teacher, you really want to have a good mix of the two modes there. But there are really cases where AI can be very engaging. So I worked on a project called tactical language learning, where people learned a foreign language by engaging in a video game style environment, right? So you had a visual game environment, you had a headset, and you were really talking to a figure. And that was very engaging for students. And they also, if they made a mistake, you know, it was just with a computer, not with a teacher. So there were a lot of benefits. But for every task, you know, there's the right balance of using AI and then nurturing other skills without using AI.
Really appreciate each talking about working that process of capacity building and confidence building through that. Yeah, next question.
Thank you very much. We're in a wonderful Christian church, and I'm speaking as one of those that's in the compelling preaching group that's here. I am a professional Christian educator for over 30 years, bachelor degree in English, master divinity degree, and a doctor of ministry degree. Now, I think one of the things that we're going to have to do in the church Christian spirituality world is we're going to have to teach our people how not to use AI for certain things. So for an example, we've got a great tradition of biblical scholarship, so that if I'm trying to understand a scripture, for God so loved the world that gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believed in him would not perish but have everlasting life. If I don't understand that, like today, I might look up parts of it on the internet, and I'll get different ideas from these different important Christian scholars and whatever. Okay, and so AI may be able to do that. You may be able to ask, okay, what does this scripture mean? And maybe it falls on some of these traditions. But what if it starts distorting certain ideas? What if, we're dealing with sacred texts? We must be able to teach our people that with these sacred texts, the translations of the words and the sentences and the flows have to be in a certain way. What if AI begins to disrupt those so that the knowledge comes out differently? And let me just add this. And Jesus says, I will pray the Father, and he will give you another helper, that he may abide with you forever, the Spirit of truth, which the world cannot receive because it neither sees him nor knows him. So in the Christian world, we believe that there is a Holy Spirit who helps believers understand Scripture, sacred Scripture, understand how to follow it and how to follow the Lord. So I believe that there are going to be ways that we're going to have to, as this world increases more and more, this AI world, we're going to have to teach our congregants how to not use it in certain areas and how to build their own strengths of biblical understanding and interpretation and following the Holy Spirit. What do you think?
I might exercise moderator's privilege, and as a religious studies scholar myself, start on this, but to give you also a moment to think about how not only for Christian preachers and educators, but some of these broader themes can speak to that. But I think what's helpful perhaps is to think about the religious studies scholar and missiologist Lamin Sanneh, who did a lot of work in West Africa from his own tradition as well. And one of the things he talked about as he looked at the history of Christian mission and the history of Christian engagement with various cultures across time and across different places is he said that the message has always existed in translation. right? There was never a time when this message was not translated through different technologies, you might say, right? And so perhaps to trust the process might be how Lamin Sanneh might speak from the grave, if I could be so bold. But to say that as we approach new tools, that the message will be embedded in the translation itself, right? Even as AI perhaps helps with those translations, that the message still speaks. And to speak into the theological realm, I think Lamin Sanneh would probably point to the Spirit's work in that, perhaps. To speak more from the religious studies perspective as well, as we talked about during our pre-event dinner, but for those of you who weren't there, religions have shown an amazing capacity to adapt to different technologies over time, and also to let those technologies adapt their message as well, and to see how it might change with the times. And that shows the great ability of religion to be able to shift and to still maintain its message in the midst of it. That's true beyond Christianity as well. Others to speak to these questions about what we place limits on, or how we can say, don't do this in order to preserve perhaps, or what kind of things might we fear in terms of the changing of a message we find is important or vital for human society. Any other thoughts or reflections on this? Yeah.
So first of all, I mean, I agree that, the role for pastors and Christian educators and the Holy Spirit is a large one. And so in the church, the direct communication is very important. From a kind of narrow AI perspective, you don't necessarily want to use general ChatGPT to answer all kinds of theological questions without any critical thought. Not a good idea. But there are ways, and there are colleagues, and this already exists, where they're, rather than training a ChatGPT on text from anywhere, they would basically say, these are good theological resources, for the Christian church, good writings, the Bible, good commentaries, and basically then train the system on a corpus that is sort of like being curated and reliable. And so that will then tend to produce answers that are spiritually then in sync with the church's teaching.
Anything else, Stephen or Darby, to add?
So, from my sort of initial set of thoughts is that a lot of the same techniques that you could use in building community around the way that people should and should not be using AI in a classroom can also be used in a religious community. I'm thinking about so I'm not a religious leader, and so perhaps this is off base, but my thought is that, as a leader in the community, you can open up room for discussion around that and talk about what you see as problematic, and have people bring in, here's what I found helpful, here's what I haven't found helpful, here's some things I'm confused about, how, what should I do about this? And give them a space to have that kind of conversation and facilitate it, and think through what kind of resources they should and shouldn't be using and why, and have that conversation together as a community. And as somebody who sort of facilitates this on a regular basis, I'm sure this is exactly in your wheelhouse to be able to do that. And in addition, there's a lot of really interesting work on trust networks in general with religious leaders. So even in cases where you're not speaking about something that's directly in your area of expertise, they found that if a leader in a religious community that is in a community that's very intensely religious, even if the community is hesitant to get, say, vaccines or something, and that religious leader runs a vaccine drive, suddenly there's a big shift in the community around the acceptance on vaccines. And it seems that because you are a trusted member of your community, you can really sort of open that space and try to get people thinking and try to influence them in a way that a lot of other people wouldn't have access to. So serving in that role as a religious leader is probably the sort of perfect way where you should just open these kinds of things up and say what you're saying here, and think it through deeply with your congregation so that you can guide them in the right way.
Yeah. I'll add on this that I was doing reporting around how the UN has fast-tracked bringing religious leaders into policy conversations because of their work around vaccines in and around the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think being a leader in this space is a way to make it happen for your people at even higher levels and at grander scales. So a couple more questions behind you, so we'll ask you to cede the mic and have a couple more to follow as well.
Thank you. I too am a member of the clergy, but as I was listening to you all talk, I had to ask myself, are we using the term AI too loosely? Has it become a colloquialism for, is what we're so concerned about in our world seeming just to be the search engine evolved to the next step? It seems that at this point that it's just taking all that has been gathered, all that has been programmed and uploaded into the server by humans, and packaging it and packaging it for presentation using the right and proper keywords, for a presentation that you might need for a paper or a speech or something like that. But is that really intelligence? Can it finish a composition that Beethoven started but died before he finished? Could we put this inside of AI and then finish this?
Right.
As Beethoven could have done it. Can it write a song or write a work of poetry that could express love or hate like a human could, to the point of making us act, or hate or love, or start a war or stop a war, as certain speeches or poems have done in the past? Or would it be merely drawing from something that was uploaded into it by one of us, drawing from our experience or not? It has been my practice to gather as much information I can as I get prepared for a sermon. And I can pull everything I can. My father, who's a preacher as well, used to always say, read Matthew Henry commentary, read all of these different things and read as much as you can, but I have to get it. And if I want to do something more than just some vanilla sermon outline, I have to get it and put it in here and sit with it for a second. And as Dr. Owen said, let the Holy Ghost work on me. Let the Holy Spirit work on me and just really think about the people that I'm going to be speaking to, and then it comes out. Mm-hmm. You might take the same information, and when you get it and internalize it, and when you speak to your congregation, it will come out completely different. But is that really AI, or is it just the progression of the technology being able to give us what somebody else has already put into it? And is it just laziness on the part of some of our students, or even on some preachers, just to take what they're given and just spit it back out there without really internalizing it? When does it actually become intelligence?
Right. Two questions I think I heard in there that I'll turn to the panel. One is the kind of continuity and connections with search engines and gathering information. And this question that kind of came up in introductory remarks is, what is intelligence, and what is intelligent about artificial intelligence, perhaps? So if we could kind of go on those two questions there, based on your experience and your knowledge, just open to the whole panel.
So I'll start with by introducing a distinction that we didn't early on that might be helpful, which is this idea of a generalized artificial intelligence, the idea of a truly foreign and intelligent thing. That doesn't exist yet, and whether or not it will isn't something I'm capable of even trying to answer right now. But it's an important distinction, because often, to your point, we do throw around intelligence in a lot of different ways, right? And often it's a placeholder for doing things that we used to do slowly, quickly, or doing things in a way that's somewhat novel. And I think that distinction is an important one when we're thinking about any artificial intelligence, whether it's narrow or generative, or, and again, I'm going to bracket the creation of a generalized artificial intelligence. But I think what's important is to really think about, when we're thinking about AI as a tool, right? Just because we can drive everywhere doesn't mean we do, right? But what's important about that distinction is that it still influences how we design where we live, right? So Los Angeles is I have to drive home, which is why I'm thinking about this. It's a city that isn't necessarily designed for pedestrians. It's designed for cars. There are cities that are designed for pedestrians. So using that analogy and sort of mirroring it to what the advent of how artificial intelligence tools can sort of get implemented in our society, we can think of organizations or congregations, for example, that are the Los Angeles of generative AI, where it's overused and it actually diminishes the human experience. Whereas we could think of walkable cities, Most of them in my head are like in Europe, where it actually improves the human experience. So I think for all of us, when we're thinking about the use of generative AI and the tools as they come to us in our professions or in our lives, is to really think about that. What does it mean for me to incorporate this new tool, no matter how it's manifested, in a way that sort of preserves what it means to be human in my human act, right? Whether it's being a preacher, whether it's being a religious leader, whether it's being just a professional, right? How do I maintain that sense of, and acknowledge that sense that we need to be human, so that we don't accidentally sort of build another Los Angeles. I do like LA, but I don't like driving here. So I think it's important to sort of think about the consequences of individual actions that scale when they become communities or larger organizations.
Other thoughts on the question from Ulf or from Darby?
So we do not have full general intelligence yet. There's still a lot of things that humans are much better at. Simple things like object identification. Certainly not replacing Beethoven. On the other hand, for a lot of things, the benchmark for AI people is not necessarily can we beat the best of humans, right? Can we do well enough? So for autonomous vehicles to make sense, they need to be safe. But the criterion is, if vehicles are safer than the average human driver, that's already pretty good, right? and might be useful. Yeah. But I still see a role. So the pastors will stay with us there. You have to find a good message and then really present to your specific congregation and audience, understand their needs. And I think that AI is not there yet. So I would see AI, as we've discussed before, as a potential tool, as an assistant, but not as a junior pastor.
One thing that I want to mention is that so you asked if there's a way that we can get AI to finish a Beethoven composition or to write something that will cause people to feel love or hate or act in a certain way. And a lot of times with the large language models that we have, we do get something incredibly vanilla, and it's not going to allow us to do that. But there are methods of using these systems where you can indeed get it to present something that sounds really good. In fact, there was a study that was done recently that had a bunch of college freshmen write up answers to ethical questions, and then had a large language model write up answers to those same ethical questions, and then asked a different set of people which answers they preferred. And by and large, people preferred the answers that came from large language models. But the reason that they preferred the answers that came from large language models is that the way that large language models work is they create the sort of agglomeration of all of the data that we have about all of human answers to these questions, and then comes up with the sort of most likely next token that spells out those answers. And in a lot of cases, actually, the LLMs just had better grammar and punctuation and things than the students did, so people were more inclined to like those ones anyway. So there is a real worry that people might be able to create, whether it's like sermons or whether it's poems or something else that will actually get us to have a response that's really sort of intensifies our human emotion, and in fact might get people to do some terrible things depending upon what the AI is suggesting. Especially if you use a model that doesn't have a lot of guardrails on it, you can get it to say some terrible things. But if you were a person that were to sit down with that model and then ask it a series of questions about what it had spit out, it wouldn't be able to answer those questions because it's not actually intelligent. It just emulates human emotion and emulates that kind of intelligence. So one of the things that I think is really important, and we've talked about this before, is having students go in and learn how to break the models and see where they break down and be like, oh, it can get me something that sounds really good, but it doesn't actually mean anything, and it's not really giving me deep meaning, and I have to go to a human in order to get a sort of deep understanding of this kind of topic. So I think that's really important.
There are many more questions to ask and many more avenues to explore. We've already touched on many of them this evening, and I'd like to thank our panelists, Darby, Vickers, Stephen Aguilar, and Ulf Hermjakob, for sharing their intelligence and their background in this. I'd also like to thank the USC's Center for Religion and Civic Culture and its compelling preaching cohort for being such an amazing part of this over the evening and in the lead up to this, and thank First Lutheran Church Venice also for hosting us. The conversation will continue afterwards, I'm sure, although many of you have to get home. A few of us might stick around and continue talking. I know we weren't able to get to one question from Peter. I'll be the first one to want to help you address it afterwards. But thank you all for being here tonight. And we hope to stay in conversation about this as we go forward. Have a good evening.